The silver-haired farmer stared at the elegant woman standing before him, her business card trembling in his weathered hand. "You want to buy my entire farm? The land my family has worked for 4 generations?" He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The same woman who'd bought straw bales from his roadside stand just weeks ago was now offering him a way out of crushing debt while allowing him to stay on his beloved land as its permanent caretaker. "Mr. Calloway," she said softly, "your farm won't just survive. It will become something extraordinary, a national wildlife sanctuary that will thrive for generations to come. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments." James Calloway wiped the sweat from his brow as the merciless August sun beat down on his failing wheat fields. At 62, his body protested with each movement, joints creaking like the weathered boards of his family's 180-acre farm in western Montana. The drought had been unforgiving this year, turning what should have been golden waves of grain into stunted, thirsty stalks, barely worth harvesting. This would make the 4th consecutive season of losses, and the bank's patience was wearing dangerously thin. The land had been in the Calloway family for 4 generations, passed down from father to son since 1889. But James feared he would be the one to lose it all. His son had left for college 8 years ago and never returned to the farming life, choosing instead a comfortable existence as an accountant in Seattle. James couldn't blame him. The boy had witnessed firsthand the cruel uncertainty of agricultural life, the endless cycle of hope and disappointment. James trudged toward his old Ford pickup, its once vibrant blue paint now faded to a patchy, rusted gray. He'd put out a small roadside stand at the end of his driveway, selling bales of straw from last year's harvest. It wasn't much, but every little bit helped keep the wolves from the door for another month. The wooden sign, painted by his late wife Carol 5 years before cancer took her, read simply, "Straw bales $5 each." As he approached the stand, James noticed a sleek silver Range Rover parked alongside the road. A woman in her mid-40s, with short-cropped dark hair, examined one of the bales, pressing her fingers into it to test its quality. She wore hiking boots, khaki pants, and a light blue button-up shirt with the sleeves rolled to her elbows. Not the typical attire of local farmers or the weekend campers who occasionally purchased his straw. "Afternoon," James called out, raising a hand in greeting, his voice gravelly from years of early mornings and too little conversation. "Looking for straw for a garden? Camping trip?" The woman turned, revealing intelligent brown eyes and a face that seemed equally at home in boardrooms and wilderness trails. "Camping, actually," she replied with a warm smile. "I'm doing some backcountry exploring in the national forest up the road. These look perfect for insulation under my tent." "They'll do the job," James nodded, arriving at the stand. "How many do you need?" "I'll take 4, please." She glanced past him toward the struggling fields and the weathered farmhouse beyond. "Beautiful land you have here. Been farming long?" "All my life," James said, hefting the first bale into the back of her vehicle. "And my father before me. And his father before him. Callaways have been working this soil since Montana was still a territory." "That's remarkable," she said, watching as he loaded the remaining bales. "Family legacy like that is becoming rare these days." James grunted, not wanting to reveal how precarious that legacy had become. $20 for the 4 bales. The woman reached into her pocket and pulled out her wallet, extracting 2 crisp $20 bills. "Keep the change," she said, handing them to him. "I'm Catherine, by the way. Catherine Reynolds." "James Calloway," he replied, pocketing the money. "Appreciate the business, Ms. Reynolds." Catherine glanced again at the fields, then pulled out a small notebook, jotting something down. "I might be camping in the area for a few weeks. Mind if I come back for more straw if needed?" "Stand's always open," James said with a shrug. "If I'm not around, just leave the money in the box." She nodded, closing her notebook. "Your farm is in a beautiful location, right at the foothills. Must be wonderful wildlife around here." "Sure is," James acknowledged, a hint of pride breaking through his weariness. "We get elk deer, black bears, even the occasional moose. Plenty of birds too, meadowlarks, bluebirds, hawks, My wife used to keep a list of all the species she spotted. Catherine's eyes lit up. She sounds like a kindred spirit. I've always been fascinated by natural ecosystems. Carol passed 5 years back, James said, the familiar ache returning. But she'd spend hours watching the wildlife. Said it was better than any television show. I'm sorry for your loss, Catherine said, her expression genuinely sympathetic. And she was right about wildlife being better than TV. James nodded, uncomfortable with the personal turn of the conversation. Well, enjoy your camping. Those forests up the road won't disappoint. I'm sure they won't, Catherine replied, climbing into her vehicle. But instead of immediately driving away, she sat for a moment, looking thoughtfully at the farmland stretching before her. Then, with a small wave, she started the engine and pulled onto the road. James watched the expensive vehicle disappear around the bend, thinking little of the encounter beyond the welcome $40 in his pocket. He returned to his daily tasks, unaware that Catherine Reynolds had not driven to the national forest, but instead had parked at a viewpoint a mile up the road, where she now stood with binoculars and a topographical map, studying his farm with intense professional interest. Catherine Reynolds was not merely a camper. As the founder and CEO of Wildlands Trust, one of the country's most successful wildlife conservation organizations, she had orchestrated the protection of over 3 million acres of critical habitat across North America. And now, her experienced eye had identified James Calloway's struggling farm as the perfect missing piece in an ambitious conservation corridor she had been assembling for years. The property's location was ideal, connecting the national forest with protected wetlands 10 miles to the east. Its varied terrain of fields, woods, and a small stream created multiple habitats. Most importantly, it sat at a crucial wildlife migration pathway that Catherine had been tracking for a decade. Back in her vehicle, Catherine made a phone call. Morgan, I need you to run a full property assessment on a farm in Riverdale County. Owner named James Calloway. She paused, listening. Yes, exactly. Full financial picture, environmental survey, wildlife corridor analysis. I think we've found our keystone property. She ended the call and started her engine, casting one more glance at the farm in her rearview mirror. James Calloway had no idea that his roadside straw sale had just set in motion events that would transform his family's legacy in ways he couldn't imagine. Over the next 3 weeks, Catherine maintained her cover as a camper, stopping by the straw stand every few days to purchase more bales and engage James in brief conversations. Each visit allowed her to gather more information about the farm, its challenges, and most importantly, about James himself. She learned about the consecutive drought years, the falling crop prices, and without James explicitly stating it, the financial troubles threatening his ownership. She observed his deep connection to the land, his knowledge of its rhythms and wildlife, and his quiet dignity in the face of mounting hardship. Meanwhile, her team at Wildlands Trust worked tirelessly behind the scenes. Morgan Chen, her chief research officer, compiled comprehensive reports on the farm's financial situation, ecological value, and potential for restoration. The legal department prepared acquisition frameworks, and Catherine's board of directors enthusiastically approved the significant investment required. 3 weeks and 2 days after her first purchase of straw bales, Catherine made her move. James was repairing a section of fence near the road when the now familiar Range Rover pulled into his driveway. Catherine emerged, but this time instead of hiking clothes, she wore tailored black pants and a professional blazer. The transformation was striking. She carried herself differently, with an unmistakable air of executive authority. "Morning, Ms. Reynolds," James called out, setting down his fencing pliers. "Need more straw for camping?" "Not today, Mr. Calloway," she replied, approaching with a leather portfolio under her arm. "I was hoping we might talk about something else. Do you have a few minutes?" Curiosity piqued, James nodded and gestured toward the house. "I could use a break and some cold water. Come on up to the porch." The farmhouse stood proudly despite its age and need for repairs. White paint peeled from the clapboard siding, and several roof shingles had broken free during the last winter storm. Still, its wraparound porch, with comfortable rocking chairs, offered a peaceful spot overlooking the property. James led Catherine to the porch and disappeared inside, returning moments later with 2 glasses of ice water. "Thank you," Catherine said, accepting the glass and taking a seat in one of the rockers. "This is a beautiful vantage point." "Carol's favorite spot," James said, lowering himself into the adjacent chair with a slight wince as his knee protested. "Now, what can I do for you, Ms. Reynolds? I'm guessing you're not really a camper." Catherine smiled, appreciating his directness. "You're right, I apologize for the pretense, but I wanted to understand your farm in this area before making a formal approach." She placed her water on a small table between them and opened her portfolio. "My name is Catherine Reynolds, and I'm the founder and CEO of Wildlands Trust." She handed him a business card, which James studied with a furrowed brow. "Conservation organization?" he read aloud. "What's this about?" "Mr. Calloway, Wildlands Trust has spent the past 15 years creating wildlife corridors and sanctuaries across the country. We've been particularly active in this region, working to connect existing protected lands to allow wildlife the freedom to migrate and thrive." Catherine paused, gauging his reaction. "Your farm occupies a crucial position in what could become one of the most important wildlife corridors in the Northern Rockies." James's expression hardened. "If you're here to pressure me into selling my family's land for some nature preserve, you're wasting your time. The Calloways have worked this soil for 4 generations, Catherine finished for him. "And I'm not here to end that legacy, Mr. Calloway. I'm here to offer a way to preserve E.T. Butt in a new form." She withdrew a document from her portfolio and handed it to him. "This is a preliminary proposal. Wildlands Trust would like to purchase your farm at 150% of its current market value." James's eyes widened at the figure at the bottom of the first page. "But this isn't a simple buyout," Catherine continued. "We want you to stay on the property as its first resident steward. You would receive a competitive annual salary to oversee the transition from farmland back to native habitat and to manage the property as it becomes the Proms Calloway Wildlife Sanctuary." James stared at her, speechless. "Your family name would be permanently attached to the land," Catherine explained, her voice gentle but passionate. "Instead of being remembered as a farm that couldn't survive changing times, it would become a lasting legacy of conservation. The debt would be gone. Your son would inherit not financial burden, but a proud family contribution to Montana's natural heritage." End quote. James's hands trembled slightly as he flipped through the proposal. "This seems impossible." "It's very real," Catherine assured him. "And it's just the beginning of the conversation. We want your input on how to honor your family's connection to this land, while allowing it to return to the wild spaces your wife so loved to observe." James stood abruptly, walking to the porch railing and looking out over his struggling fields. The farm that had been both his prison and his purpose for over 4 decades. The land that held the bones of his ancestors and the ashes of his beloved Carol. "I need time to think," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "This isn't a decision I can make standing here on my porch." "Of course," Catherine said, joining him at the railing but careful to give him space. "Take all the time you need. This proposal is just a starting point. We can modify any aspect to better fit what you envision." James turned to look at her, his weathered face unreadable. "Why my farm? There must be others that would work for your corridor." "There are alternatives," Catherine acknowledged. "But none with the unique combination of location, habitat diversity, and—" She hesitated, then continued, "and a caretaker who already knows and loves the land. Someone who understands the wildlife and the seasonal patterns. That knowledge is invaluable, Mr. Calloway. It would take decades for someone else to develop what you already carry in your head and heart." James looked away, uncomfortable with her perception of qualities he took for granted. "And," Catherine added softly, "I believe this is what Carol would have wanted. A sanctuary where those meadowlarks and bluebirds she tracked could thrive for generations to come." The mention of his late wife's name seemed to catch James off guard. He straightened his shoulders and cleared his throat. "I'll review your proposal. Can you come back next week? Same day?" "Absolutely," Catherine agreed, gathering her materials. "And please, call me with any questions before then. My direct number is on the card. As James walked her back to her vehicle, they passed the small roadside stand with its hand-painted sign. Catherine paused. Your wife made that sign, didn't she? James nodded. It would make a wonderful marker at the entrance to the sanctuary, Catherine suggested gently. The first of many ways to ensure her presence remains part of this land's story. With that, she climbed into her Range Rover and drove away, leaving James standing by the straw bales, the proposal clutched in his hand, his mind reeling with possibilities he had never dared to imagine. The week that followed was one of profound soul-searching for James. He read and reread the proposal, made notes in the margins, and spent hours walking his property, seeing it through new eyes. Land that he had viewed as failing crop fields, he now imagined as restored prairie. The eroded stream bank could become a lush riparian zone. The rocky hillside where nothing would grow might one day host a viewing platform where visitors could observe the wildlife Carol had so treasured. On the third day, he called his son in Seattle. Dad? Everything okay? Michael Calloway answered, concern evident in his voice. His father rarely called midweek. Fine, James assured him. Got something important to discuss, though. How busy are you this weekend? There was a pause on the line. I can make time. What's going on? Rather explain in person. It's about the farm, about the future. The gravity in his father's tone prompted Michael to book a flight immediately. He arrived late Friday night, and over a simple breakfast on Saturday morning, James laid out Catherine's proposal, watching his son's expression transform from skepticism to astonishment and finally to growl. Cautious enthusiasm. This is incredible, Michael said, studying the financial details. With his accounting background, he quickly grasped the stability the arrangement would provide. No more debt hanging over your head, a steady income, healthcare benefits. He looked up at his father. And you'd still live here, on the land. That's what I keep coming back to, James admitted. I wouldn't have to leave, wouldn't have to watch someone else tear down what the Callaways built and put up vacation homes or whatever else they're doing with farmland these days. Michael nodded, understanding the weight of legacy that had always been central to his father's identity. What would your daily work look like? What exactly does a resident steward do? James pushed across a section of the proposal. Seems I'd guide the restoration work, help identify which areas need what kind of attention, track the wildlife as they return, eventually lead tours and educational programs about the land's history both as a farm and as it transitions back to natural habitat. End quote. You'd be good at that, Michael said with a small smile. You know more about this land than anyone alive. There's a lot I don't know, James countered. All those scientific names, the ecology terminology, I'm just a farmer. Dad, Michael said firmly, you're a steward of the land already. You've just been growing wheat instead of prairie grasses. The principles aren't cod. So different. They spent the weekend walking the property together, something they hadn't done since Michael was a teenager. James pointed out where the elk typically crossed in autumn, the grove of cottonwoods where great horned owls nested, the spring that never ran dry even in the worst drought years. Michael listened with newfound appreciation for his father's intimate knowledge, seeing how naturally it could translate to this new role. By Sunday evening, sitting on the porch as the setting sun painted the distant mountains gold, they had reached a decision. You sure about this? James asked, studying his son's face in the fading light. It changes everything about your inheritance. Michael laughed softly. Dad, my inheritance was looking more like a mountain of debt each year. This way, I get to see you secure and happy during your lifetime. And yes, someday I'll inherit a legacy I can be proud of, even if I can't sell it for Don. Development. You could have sold it anyway, James pointed out. After I'm gone. And have your ghost haunt me for eternity? Michael shook his head. No thanks. This is better for everyone you, me, the wildlife, the planet. He paused. Mom would have loved this. James nodded, his throat tight. That's what Reynolds said too. And she's right. When Catherine returned the following Wednesday, she found not just James waiting for her, but Michael as well. The three sat around the kitchen table, the proposal between them, covered in notes and questions. For nearly 3 hours, they negotiated details: a slightly higher purchase price, provisions for Michael to build a small cabin on the property someday, clarifications about James's healthcare coverage and retirement benefits, and specifics about how the Calloway family history would be preserved and honored in the sanctuary's educational materials. Catherine addressed each concern thoroughly, making revisions and additions to the agreement. Her genuine respect for the family's connection to the land established a foundation of trust that made the complex transition feel more like a partnership than a transaction. "There's one more thing," James said as they neared the end of their discussion. "I want to be involved in choosing which parts of the farm are restored first. I've got some ideas about where we could make the biggest impact for the wildlife corridor." Catherine smiled broadly. "That's exactly the kind of input we were hoping for, James. Your knowledge will be the cornerstone of our restoration plan." By late afternoon, with sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows illuminating decades of family photos on the walls, James Calloway signed the preliminary agreement. Catherine would take it back to finalize with her legal team, but the foundation was laid. The Calloway farm would become the Calloway Wildlife Sanctuary, and a new chapter would begin. As Catherine prepared to leave, James walked her to her car one final time as a farmer. The next time they met, he would be taking his first steps as a resident steward. "You know," he said, looking back at the weathered farmhouse, "when you first pulled up here buying straw bales, I never imagined you'd end up saving my family's legacy." Catherine smiled. "Sometimes the most important journeys begin with the smallest steps. In this case, a simple bale of straw." She extended her hand, and James shook it firmly. "Welcome to Wildlands Trust, Mr. Calloway. I think this is the beginning of an extraordinary transformation for this land, and for you." As her car disappeared down the driveway, James stood motionless, experiencing a feeling he hadn't known in years: hope. The crushing weight of impending failure that had become his constant companion was lifting, replaced by the promise of purpose and possibility. He turned back toward his home, seeing it now not as a symbol of what he was losing, but as the center of what was yet to come. The first year of transition passed in a whirlwind of activity. The official purchase was completed by mid-October, just after James harvested his final wheat crop, smaller than ever but symbolically important as the end of one era and the beginning of another. Catherine brought in a team of ecologists, biologists, and restoration specialists who spent weeks surveying the property, cataloging existing plant and animal species, and developing a comprehensive restoration plan. James worked alongside them, his practical knowledge complementing their scientific expertise. He found unexpected satisfaction in their respectful attention when he shared insights about the land's seasonal patterns, the areas prone to erosion, and the wildlife behaviors he'd observed over decades. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the lead ecologist, became a regular presence at the farmhouse kitchen table, spreading out maps and plans as she and James debated the best approaches for different sections of the property. "The north field drains poorly," James would point out. "Always has. Trying to establish those particular grasses there might be fighting an uphill battle." Elena would consider this, cross-reference with soil samples, and often adjust the plans accordingly. "This is why having you here is invaluable, James," she told him one evening as they reviewed the day's work. "You've got 60 years of direct observation that no scientific study could replicate." By spring, the first major restoration project began converting 40 acres of former wheat fields to native prairie. James watched with mixed emotions as teams arrived with specialized equipment and thousands of seedlings of Montana's indigenous grasses and wildflowers. "Feels strange," he confided to Catherine, who visited monthly to check on progress. "Spent my whole life trying to keep those weeds out of my crops. Now we're planting them on purpose." Catherine smiled understanding. "It's a different kind of cultivation, but you're still growing things. Just what was meant to be here all along." As spring turned to summer, James discovered a new routine. Mornings began with wildlife observations, documenting what species were using which parts of the property. Afternoons often involved guiding restoration work or meeting with various specialists. And in the evenings, he found himself doing something that would have been unthinkable during his farming years: reading. His coffee table gradually accumulated books on native plants, wildlife ecology, and conservation history. Michael, on his increasingly frequent visits from Seattle, remarked on the transformation. "Dad, you're turning into a naturalist, just trying to understand the language these scientists speak," James grumbled, but there was no denying the genuine interest behind his studies. By midsummer, the changes were becoming visible. The first restored prairie section exploded with colorful wildflowers, attracting clouds of butterflies and buzzing with pollinators. The eroded stream bank, now reinforced with native willows and dogwoods, showed signs of stabilizing. And most excitingly, wildlife began responding to the changes. "Dad!" Michael called out early one July morning, pointing toward the newly established wetland area that had once been an unproductive corner of farmland. "Look!" James raised his binocular saw gift from Catherine on his official first day as resident stewardant, focused on the scene. A family of sandhill cranes waded through the shallow waters, their distinctive red crowns vivid against the green vegetation. "Well, I'll be damned," James whispered. "Haven't seen cranes on this property since I was a boy." It was the first of many such moments. Each returning species felt like a personal validation, a sign that the radical change in the land's purpose had been the right choice. A family of otters established themselves along the revitalized stream. Deer and elk began using the property more frequently as a passage between the mountains and the valley. The bird population exploded in diversity, and James found himself channeling Carol as he meticulously recorded each species in a leather-bound journal. The sanctuary began taking shape in other ways, too. A small, tastefully designed visitor center was constructed near the entrance, incorporating reclaimed wood from an old barn that had been beyond saving. Inside, displays told the story of the land, its geological formation, indigenous use, settlement by the Callaway family, its years as a productive farm, and now its reawakening as a sanctuary. James's family history featured prominently, with photographs spanning 4 generations working the same fields that visitors could now see transforming back to their natural state. Carol's hand-painted sign, carefully restored, hung above the main entrance. As word spread locally about the project, reactions were mixed. Some neighboring farmers viewed James's decision with suspicion, or even betrayal, seeing it as capitulation to outside environmental interests. Others, particularly those facing similar financial struggles, approached him privately to learn more about the arrangement. "Not saying I'd do it myself," one such neighbor, Frank Wilson, said after a lengthy discussion in town. "But I got to admit, you look better than you have in years, James. Less weight on your shoulders." "Different weight," James corrected. "Still work to be done every day. Still challenges. But yeah, it's easier to sleep at night without the bank breathing down my neck." By the sanctuary's official opening in the fall of the second year, the transformation was well underway, both of the land and of James himself. He had traded his farmer's cap for the official khaki hat of Wildlands Trust, though he still wore his familiar worn work jacket. His vocabulary had expanded to include terms like ecotone and keystone species, which he deployed with increasing confidence as he led the first public tours. Catherine attended the opening ceremony, standing proudly beside James as they cut a ribbon made of woven prairie grasses. Local media covered the event, and James found himself unexpectedly comfortable in the spotlight, speaking passionately about the importance of the wildlife corridor and the sanctuary's role in it. "This land has always been alive," he told the gathered crowd, his voice strong despite his initial nervousness. "For generations my family worked with it, coaxing food from the soil. Now we're working with it in a different way, helping it remember what it was before plows ever broke the prairie. And in return, it's helping me remember something too, that being a steward of the land means different things in different times." He glanced at Catherine, who nodded encouragingly. "The Callaway legacy isn't ending," James continued. "It's evolving. My great-grandfather came here because he saw potential in this soil. Today, we're honoring that vision by recognizing the land's potential in a new era." The applause that followed was led by Michael, who had flown in for the event with news of his own hay, had accepted a job with an accounting firm in Missoula, just an hour's drive away. allowing him to be much more involved in the sanctuary's development. As visitors dispersed to explore the newly established trails, Catherine found James standing quietly by Carol's sign. "She would be proud," Catherine said softly, "of the sanctuary, and of you." James nodded, running his fingers lightly over the faded lettering. "She always said I was too stubborn for my own good. Guess it took me too long to see there was another way forward." "Not too long," Catherine assured him. "Perfect timing, actually. For the wildlife corridor, for Wildlands Trust, and for you." James smiled, the deep creases around his eyes testament to years of squinting into Montana sunrises. "Never thought selling straw bales would change my life." "It wasn't the straw," Catherine said, matching his smile. "It was you. Your connection to this land was palpable from our first conversation. That's what convinced me this could work." As twilight settled over the sanctuary, James walked one of his favorite paths alone, listening to the evening chorus of insects and the distant hooting of a great horned owl, probably one of the pair that nested in the Firker Cottonwood Grove. He paused at a viewpoint that overlooked the most dramatically transformed section of the property, where vibrant prairie had replaced struggling wheat. The scene before him bore little resemblance to the farm he had known his entire life, yet somehow it felt right. The land seemed to breathe more easily, and so did he. In giving up his fight to maintain the farm against mounting odds, he had found a different kind of success. One measured not in bushels and market prices, but in returning birdsong and flourishing native plants. The irony wasn't lost on him that, in failing as a farmer, he had succeeded in preserving everything that truly mattered about his family's connection to this place. The Callaway name would remain tied to this land, not as conquerors who bent nature to their will, but as partners in its restoration and protectors of its future. James started back toward the farmhouse's home, as it would remain for the rest of his days. Tomorrow would bring new visitors to guide, restoration projects to oversee, and wildlife to document. His hands would still work this land, just with different tools and different purpose. As darkness fell completely, James paused one last time, looking up at the vast spread of stars visible in Montana's clear night sky. The same stars that had guided his great-grandfather to this valley, that had watched over generations of Callaways as they worked from sunrise to sunset. That had witnessed the land's transformation from wilderness to farm, and now, in an unimaginable turn of events, back toward wilderness again. "We did all right, Carol," he whispered to the night. "Different than we planned, but we did all right." A gentle breeze stirred the prairie grasses, carrying the sweet scent of wildflowers and the promise of seasons yet to come in the sanctuary that had once been a struggling farm. Sanctuary born from a simple roadside sale of straw bales and the vision of a woman who saw potential where others saw only failure. Over the next 3 years, the Callaway Wildlife Sanctuary flourished beyond even Catherine's optimistic projections. The restored habitats matured, creating a mosaic of prairie, wetlands, riparian zones, and managed woodland that attracted increasingly diverse wildlife. Trail cameras documented the return of species that hadn't been seen on the property in decades. Bobcats, a family of badgers, even a passing wolf that caused equal parts excitement and controversy in the local community. James's role evolved as well. What began as primarily consulting on the land's history and physical characteristics expanded into something much more comprehensive. His natural storytelling ability and authentic connection to the property made him the sanctuary's most compelling ambassador. School groups particularly responded to his tales of growing up on the farm, working the land with his father, and the difficult but rewarding decision to transform it into a sanctuary. "Mr. Callaway," a third grader asked during one such visit, "do you miss being a farmer?" James considered the question carefully. "I miss certain parts of it," he acknowledged. "The satisfaction of a good harvest, the rhythm of the seasons dictating your work. But I don't miss the worry, and I've found new satisfactions here." To illustrate his point, he led the children to a flourishing meadow that 2 years earlier had been an unproductive field where nothing would grow properly. Now it buzzed with insects and fluttered with butterflies feeding on native wildflowers. "See that monarch butterfly?" he asked, pointing to a striking orange and black insect. "When I was your age, There were so many of them they'd cover whole trees during migration. Then they became rare. Now they're coming back, partly because of places like this that provide what they need. That's a different kind of harvest, but just as rewarding. The sanctuary's success caught the attention of conservation organizations and academic institutions. Researchers frequently visited to study the rapid ecological recovery, and several universities established ongoing monitoring programs that provided valuable data while offering students hands-on field experience. James found himself collaborating with these researchers, his observational knowledge complementing their scientific approaches. He even co-authored a paper for an ecological journal, something that would have been unimaginable in his farming days. Michael framed the publication and hung it proudly in the farmhouse living room. The sanctuary's impact extended beyond its boundaries as well. Inspired by the Callaway model, Wildlands Trust initiated discussions with other struggling farmers in strategic locations along the planned wildlife corridor. 2 neighboring properties joined the network within the first 3 years, creating an expanding patchwork of protected lands. More surprisingly, even farmers who chose to continue agricultural operations began implementing conservation measures on portions of their land buffer zones along streams, hedgerows to prevent erosion, set aside areas for pollinator habitat. James often found himself in the unlikely role of consultant, helping these farmers integrate conservation practices with traditional agriculture. "Never thought I'd see you turn into an environmentalist," Frank Wilson commented during one such consultation on his property. "Never thought I'd see you planting wildflowers," James countered with a smile. "Times change. We either change with them or get left behind." The sanctuary's visitor numbers grew steadily, becoming an unexpected economic driver for the small community. A bed and breakfast opened in town specifically catering to wildlife enthusiasts. The local diner added sanctuary specials to its menu. A former feed store converted to selling outdoor gear, books on local ecology, and wildlife photography equipment. On the 3rd anniversary of the sanctuary's opening, Catherine organized a special celebration. The event featured not only the Callaway Sanctuary, but highlighted the entire growing wildlife corridor that now connected previously isolated habitats across nearly 30 miles. James, now 68, but more energetic than he'd been in years, gave the keynote address to a crowd triple the size of the original opening. 3 years ago, I stood here thinking this was the end of one thing and the beginning of another, he began. I was only half right. What I've learned is that there are no clean endings or beginnings in nature, just continuous transformation. He gestured toward the vibrant landscape around them. These native grasses have roots that go down 15 feet deeper than any crop I ever planted. They were always there, dormant in the soil, waiting for their chance to grow again. Just like the potential for this sanctuary was always here, waiting for the right conditions. James paused, making eye contact with Catherine in the front row. When Ms. Reynolds stopped to buy straw bales that day, she saw what I couldn't see, that my failing farm could become something extraordinary. That transformation isn't just happening on this land, it's happening in our community, in our understanding of stewardship, and in me. The applause was warm and genuine. Catherine joined him at the podium, presenting him with a special recognition award that would hang permanently in the visitor center alongside the story of the sanctuary's origin. James Callaway embodies the spirit of what Wildlands Trust aims to achieve, she told the audience. Not just conservation of land, but conservation of connection between people and nature. His willingness to reimagine his family's legacy has created a model that we're now replicating across the country. After the ceremony, as twilight settled over the sanctuary, James found himself walking familiar paths with Michael and Catherine. Did you ever imagine it would become this successful? Michael asked Catherine, gesturing toward the thriving landscape around them. Catherine nodded thoughtfully. I had high hopes, but the reality has exceeded even my optimistic projections. The speed of ecological recovery has been remarkable. Good soil, James said simply. Just needed the right seeds. They paused at a viewpoint overlooking a series of small ponds that had been established where drainage had always been poor for farming. Now they teemed with life cattails swaying in the breeze, frogs calling to one another, a blue heron patiently hunting along the marshy edge. The university researchers documented 53 bird species nesting on the property this year, Catherine noted. Up from 38 when we started. Carol would have loved that, James said quietly. She took her bird list in an old notebook. I found it when we were preparing the historical displays. She had recorded 42 species over 30 years of watching. So we've already surpassed her list, Michael observed. James nodded. She would have been thrilled. He turned to Catherine. Thank you. Not just for saving this land, but for giving me a new purpose. Catherine smiled, her face softened by the golden light of sunset. You've done as much for Wildlands Trust as we've done for you. James. Your story has opened doors with other landowners who might never have considered conservation. You've shown that environmental protection doesn't have to mean erasing human connection to the land. As they walked back toward the farmhouse, now serving as both James's home and an administrative center for the sanctuary, the conversation turned to future plans. The educational programs are booked solid through next spring, Michael reported. He had reduced his accounting work to part-time to help manage the sanctuary's growing operations. We've had to start a waiting list for school visits. We should consider expanding the visitor facilities, Catherine suggested. Perhaps repurposing some of the old outbuildings for additional classroom space? The old workshop would work, James agreed. Good structure, just needs updating. And we should add more trails in the north section. The oak viewing opportunities up there are exceptional in the early morning. They continued discussing possibilities, the three of them now a seamless team despite their different backgrounds and initial purposes. As darkness fell completely, they reached the farmhouse porch, where James had first read Catherine's proposal 4 years earlier. Catherine checked her watch reluctantly. I should head back to Missoula for my flight tomorrow. The board meeting is on Monday, and I need to prepare our expansion proposal. Will you talk about the Johnson property? Michael asked, referring to a neighboring farm whose elderly owner had recently expressed interest in a similar arrangement to his father's. It's the centerpiece of the presentation, Catherine confirmed. If we can secure that land, we'll have continuous protected habitat for almost 40 miles. James gazed out at his former fields, now transforming into their natural state, barely visible in the gathering darkness except as textures and shadows. It's bigger than any of us now, isn't it? This has gone beyond saving one old farmer's legacy. It was always bigger, Catherine said gently. But sometimes, big changes need a single catalyst like a roadside straw stand and a farmer willing to reimagine his future. After Catherine departed, James and Michael sat on the porch in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the sanctuary, crickets, frogs, an occasional coyote call in the distance. You know what's funny, Dad? Michael said eventually. When I was a kid, all I wanted was to get away from this place. The endless work, the financial stress, the isolation. Now I'm voluntarily spending half my time here. James chuckled. Life has a way of circling back. But it's a different place now, different purpose. Different father, too, Michael observed. I don't think I've ever seen you as content as you've been these past few years. James considered this. Farming was always a battle against weather, market prices, equipment breaking down, always trying to control everything and usually failing. This work is different. We're not fighting nature. We're letting it lead. There's a peace in that I never knew before. The conversation drifted to practical matters, upcoming projects, decisions about trail maintenance, plans for the winter educational programs. As they talked, a sense of rightness settled over James. A bone-deep certainty that despite all logic and family tradition, the transformation of the Callaway farm into a wildlife sanctuary had been the correct path. Later that night, after Michael had gone to bed in what had once been his childhood room, James sat alone at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and his wildlife journal. He carefully recorded the day's observations: a Merlin falcon spotted near the eastern boundary, fresh beaver activity along the stream, the first autumn colors appearing on the cottonwoods. His entry complete, he closed the journal and ran his hand over its leather cover, thinking of Carol's similar notebook now preserved in the visitor center display. There was comfort in these small continuities, these threads connecting past and present. James rose and moved to the window, looking out at the sanctuary under the light of a nearly full moon. Silver light bathed the landscape, turning the prairie grasses to flowing waves and picking out the silhouettes of trees against the sky. In the distance, he could make out the dark shapes of deer, grazing peacefully in what had once been his most productive wheat field. The sight no longer filled him with the conflict it might have a few years earlier. Instead, there was only a quiet satisfaction. The land was alive and thriving, fulfilling its natural purpose rather than struggling to be something it was not. Much like himself, James reflected with a small smile. He had spent decades trying to force success in a role that became increasingly untenable, only to find unexpected fulfillment by embracing change instead of resisting it. As winters settled over the sanctuary, activities shifted indoors. The visitor center hosted weekend workshops on wildlife photography, native plant propagation, and conservation history. James developed a popular series called Farming to Rewilding, where he shared the practical and emotional aspects of the transition with audiences ranging from curious locals to conservation professionals. The hardest part wasn't the physical changes to the land, he explained during one such session. It was changing how I saw myself. For 60 years, I was a farmer. My father was a farmer. His father was a farmer. Who was I, if not a farmer? A woman in the audience raised her hand. "And who are you now, Mr. Calloway?" James smiled. "Now? I'm a storyteller, a guide, a witness to an extraordinary transformation, and still a steward of the Calloway land, just in a different way than I ever imagined." The winter also brought a special personal development. Michael proposed to his girlfriend, Layla, an environmental educator he had met through the sanctuary's programs. They planned a small wedding for the following summer, to be held on sanctuary grounds. "Right by the cottonwood grove," Michael suggested during Christmas dinner at the farmhouse. "It's beautiful there, and Mom always loved those trees." James nodded approval, emotion tightening his throat. She'd be honored, and happy to see the farm hosting celebrations, rather than just hard work. Layla, a vibrant woman with a background in ecology and education, had become an integral part of the sanctuary's programs, bringing expertise that complemented James's practical knowledge. Her enthusiasm for the project matched Michael's, and together they were developing plans for expanded educational offerings that would secure the sanctuary's relevance for years to come. "We're thinking of adding summer camp programs," Layla explained as they enjoyed apple pie before the fireplace. Week-long immersive experiences for kids to connect with nature. James could teach traditional skills like tracking and plant identification, connecting the agricultural history with current conservation. "Turning me into a camp counselor in my retirement years?" James asked with mock severity, though his eyes showed interest. "More like an elder wise man," Michael teased. The kids would love learning from someone who's seen this land through so many changes. As they discussed possibilities, James felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Not only was the land finding renewed purpose, but it was drawing his son back, creating continuity where he had once feared there would be an end. And now, with Layla and the possibility of grandchildren someday, the Calloway connection to this place might extend to yet another generation differently than he had ever imagined, but perhaps more meaningfully. Spring brought rapid changes to the sanctuary. New growth erupted everywhere, native grasses pushing through the soil, trees leafing out, wildflowers creating patches of vibrant color across the landscape. Wildlife activity intensified, with migratory birds returning and resident species beginning their breeding seasons. The 5-year mark approached a significant milestone in the sanctuary's development and in James's journey from farmer to conservation steward. Catherine planned a special anniversary event, coordinating with national media to showcase the project as a model for similar transitions across the country. "The Calloway Sanctuary has become our flagship example of agricultural to wildlife conversion," she told James during a planning meeting. "We've now replicated aspects of this model in 6 states, but this remains the most successful example. What makes it different?" James asked, genuinely curious about why his property had thrived while others faced greater challenges. Catherine considered the question carefully. "Several factors. The location is ideal for wildlife connectivity. The varied terrain provides multiple habitat types. But honestly, James, the biggest difference is you. He raised an eyebrow skeptically. I'm serious, Catherine insisted. Your knowledge of the land, your community connections that helped overcome local resistance, your authentic passion for the project. We can fund ecological restoration anywhere, but having the right person to shepherd the transition makes all the difference. End quote. The 5-year anniversary celebration coincided with Michael and Layla's wedding, creating a week of events that highlighted both the sanctuary's ecological success and its human story. Visitors came from across the country: conservation professionals, journalists, government officials, and curious citizens interested in the model. The day before the public celebrations began, Catherine arrived with a surprise guest, Congresswoman Diane Weston, who chaired the House Committee on Natural Resources. The Congresswoman has been following our progress here, Catherine explained, as James welcomed them to the farmhouse. She's interested in developing federal incentives for similar transitions on struggling agricultural lands. This is a remarkable achievement, Mr. Calloway, the Congresswoman said, accepting a cup of coffee at the kitchen table, where so many crucial conversations about the sanctuary had taken place. A private solution that benefits the environment, preserves rural heritage, and creates new economic opportunities for the region. I'm just one piece of the puzzle, James said modestly. Wildlands Trust provided the vision and the resources. The land provided the potential. I'm just the caretaker. A critical piece, Congresswoman Weston insisted. My committee is exploring legislation that would provide tax incentives and transitional support for farmers willing to convert portions of their land to wildlife habitat. Your experience would be invaluable in shaping effective policy. The conversation continued into specific recommendations: what support was most needed, what challenges had to be overcome, how to respect agricultural traditions while encouraging conservation innovation. James found himself speaking with unexpected confidence about policy issues he would never have engaged with in his farming days. As they concluded, the Congresswoman asked for a tour of the sanctuary, and James gladly obliged. As they walked familiar paths, now well established and showing 5 years of ecological recovery, he pointed out successes and challenges with equal honesty. This wetland area has exceeded all expectations, he explained, indicating a thriving marsh that had once been unproductive farmland. But over here, we're still struggling with invasive species that were introduced during the farming years. It's a continuous process, not a one-time fix. Congresswoman Weston listened attentively, occasionally making notes. What strikes me most is how you talk about this land, Mr. Calloway. There's none of the bitterness one might expect from someone who had to give up farming. Instead, there's pride. James nodded slowly. The pride never left. It just shifted. My family worked this land for generations. We were part of its story. Now, that story continues, just with a different chapter. The wedding day dawned clear and perfect. Under the ancient cottonwoods that Carol had loved, Michael and Layla exchanged vows before friends, family, and many who had become both through their connection to the sanctuary. James, standing proudly as his son's best man, found himself overwhelmed by the convergence of endings and beginnings, losses and gains that had brought them all to this moment. The evening reception took place on the sanctuary grounds, with tables set up near the visitor center, under strings of soft lights. With the sounds of the awakening night creatures providing a fitting backdrop, Catherine raised a toast to the couple and to the sanctuary's 5-year milestone. 5 years ago, a roadside straw sale changed the course of this land and the lives of the Calloway family, she said, glass raised. Today, we celebrate new beginnings: Michael and Layla's marriage, the sanctuary's continued growth, and the expanding vision of conservation that you've all helped create. She turned to face James directly. James, when I first drove up to your straw stand, I saw potential in this land. But I could never have imagined how fully that potential would be realized, not just ecologically, but in human terms. You've turned a transaction into a transformation, a business deal into a legacy. Late that night, after the guests had departed and Michael and Layla had left for their honeymoon, James sat alone on his porch. reflecting on the day and the journey of the past 5 years. The night was alive with sound, a chorus of frogs from the wetlands, crickets in the grass, and howl calling from the cottonwood grove where his son had just been married. He thought about the winding path that had brought him here, the desperate financial situation that had once seemed like failure, the chance encounter with Catherine that had opened an unexpected door, the difficult decision to let go of one dream to embrace another. The Callaway farm was gone. In its place, the Callaway Wildlife Sanctuary thrived, breathing new life into land that had been struggling and creating opportunities that would extend far beyond his own lifetime. What had begun as a last resort to avoid bankruptcy had become a purposeful legacy that honored the past while serving the future. James's gaze traveled across the moonlit landscape, taking in the varied habitats that had replaced uniform crop fields. Native grasses swayed in the gentle breeze. The restored stream caught glints of moonlight. Somewhere in the distance, an elk bugled a sound his great-grandfather might have heard when he first claimed this land, a sound that had been absent for generations, and a sound that now symbolized the renewal of something precious. He thought of Carol B., wishing she could see what their farm had become. She had always been the one to notice the wildlife, to appreciate the beauty alongside the productivity. She would have understood this transformation better than anyone. "We did good, Carol," he whispered into the night. "Different than we planned, but good." A shooting star streaked across the sky, and James smiled at the timing. Not a sign, perhaps, but a fitting punctuation to the thought. He rose from his chair, feeling the familiar aches of age, but also the satisfaction of purpose fulfilled, and headed inside to his farmhouse, still his home, still the center of Callaway land, but now the heart of something larger and more enduring than he had ever dared to imagine. The Callaway Wildlife Sanctuary would continue to grow and change, as would James's role within it. There would be challenges and adjustments, successes and occasional setbacks. But the fundamental transformation had taken hold of the land, of the community's relationship with it, and of James himself. What had begun with a simple roadside transaction, a wildlife CEO purchasing straw bales from a struggling farmer, had blossomed into something neither could have fully envisioned. A meeting of need and opportunity, of crisis and vision, had created not just a sanctuary for wildlife, but a new kind of human relationship with the land, one that honored agriculture's past while embracing conservation's future. And at the center of it all stood James Callaway, no longer just a farmer, not quite a scientist, but something unique and valuable, a bridge between worlds, a keeper of knowledge, and a steward of a legacy reborn. By turning his failing farm into thriving wildlife habitat, James had discovered that true stewardship sometimes means letting go of control and allowing the land to remember what it once was, and in doing so, he had found a peace and purpose that had eluded him through decades of struggling to hold on to what was slipping away. The straw bales that had brought Catherine to his doorstep now nurtured new life in the sanctuary, providing shelter for small mammals, nesting material for birds, and eventually returning to the soil to feed the next generation of native plants. Like those simple bales, James had found his own way to support new beginnings while honoring his connection to the land that had shaped his entire life. Under the vast Montana sky, the Callaway Wildlife Sanctuary thrived not as an ending to a family's agricultural story, but as its evolution into something that would endure far beyond any single lifetime. The roots ran deep, just like the native prairie grasses, now reclaiming their ancient place on the land, roots connecting past to future in ways both visible and invisible, practical and profound. And for James Callaway, that knowledge brought a quiet joy that deepened with each passing season, with each new species that returned, with each visitor who came to learn and left understanding something essential about the relationship between humans and the natural world. It had all begun with straw bales, a roadside stand, and a visionary woman who saw potential where others saw only failure. From those humble beginnings had grown something extraordinary, a sanctuary not just for wildlife, but for the human spirit that seeks meaning and continuity in an ever-changing world.